Do you remember the Oscar Best Picture winners of the 1920s? Last year, on the cusp of Oscar season, I did a video that covered Wings, the Broadway Melody, and the sort of Best Picture winner, Sunrise. And it was really fun to go and look back at those early Oscar winners and kind of see what people in the Academy were thinking now almost 100 years ago, and what films really resonated with audiences back in that particular time. And so with the Oscars creeping up on us, I thought, what better way to continue this trend than by looking at the winners of the 1930s? So I've split it into two pieces. Today we'll look at 1930 through 1934, and next week 1935 to 1939. Again, I'm simplifying the Oscar years because those early winners weren't done by strict calendar years. They were kind of divided up. So you see things like 1931 to 1932 winner. To simplify, we'll just assign each film one individual year. And the first one, the winner for 1930, Lewis Milestone's epic All Quiet on the Western Front. Based on the book often assigned in high schools, a very depressing read by Erich Maria Remarque, the kind of biographical novel about the experience of German soldiers in World War I. All Quiet on the Western Front was an international bestseller and absolutely screamed for a film adaptation. And with Lewis Milestone directing and Lew Ayres in the lead role, it certainly delivered. All Quiet on the Western Front is one of the few early Best Picture winners that's still very popular today. It's been remade at least twice, but the original still holds up pretty darn well. Those of you who've watched my videos for a while might recognize the Universal Cinema Classics release as well. But a very simple story. During World War I, German teenagers are recruited into the army and quickly realize it's a lot more than glamour and gallantry. There's a lot more to do with just trying to stay alive. This was from the Universal Centenary series, so I've got this little leaflet I'll show you real quick. It's pretty cool. And the special edition release, this has both the silent and sound versions. The sound version is technically the Best Picture winner, but the silent version does use some alternate takes and alternate footage and so on. Really nice release here. The last time I watched every Best Picture winner consecutively and ranked them was 2011, and when I did that, All Quiet on the Western Front came out as my #1 choice. There is just so much to say about it. The movie is incredibly graphic, especially for its time. There's a very famous scene of a soldier being blown up with a grenade, and all that remains are his hands clenched onto the barbed wire that he was holding right before he blew up. All kinds of impressive panning shots and tracking shots of people being blown apart by machine guns and artillery. Sound is used strategically to make us hear the barrages before we ever see them. That kind of thing. Really ahead of its time in a lot of ways. Lew Ayres is terrific in the lead. Yeah, he has a few scenes where he goes pretty hammy and crazy, but for the most part, I mean, he works with a lot of stuff that's very difficult and dreary. It's one of the first Best Picture winners to have, perhaps the first actually, to have a sex scene. Granted, it's done in silhouette and it works more by implication, but nonetheless, that's something we wouldn't really see again for a while. And a very depressing downer ending that, again, uses sound very strategically and holds up quite well even today. And I can't praise All Quiet on the Western Front enough. Yes, it's probably not for everyone, and it is extremely depressing to watch, but at the end of the day, it's, truly, I think, a work of art, and a very worthy start for a look at 1930s Best Picture winners. And if you haven't ever read the book, I definitely recommend reading the book as well. The movie follows it quite closely. So we have one of the few early Best Picture winners that's held in high regard, so we go to one that is often named amongst the worst of all the Oscar winners, 1931, Cimarron. Based on the book by Edna Ferber. I have a big collection of her works there for you. You might recognize some of those other titles, like Showboat, which was a novel before it was a musical. Giant, of course, made into a very famous film with Rock Hudson and Elizabeth Taylor and James Dean. Cimarron is almost in a way the history of Oklahoma. It starts with one of the most impressive scenes in Oscar history, a full reenactment of the 1889 Oklahoma land rush. You can see that's used on the front of the package there. and even on the back as well. That's easily what the movie's most remembered for, and is a very impressive scene. But then it follows the story of Yancey and Sabra Cravat, seen here on the front, up through 1930, through all these different stages of Oklahoma's history. It's difficult to cram 40 years into roughly 2 hours, and the movie doesn't always do a good job of sort of pacing itself well. Some things are dwelled on for way too long, others are kind of rushed through. Cimarron is not well liked, one reason being for the acting. I love Richard Dix. He was great in the 1943 movie The Ghost Ship, easily his best performance. He was a big star in the silent era, but he is absolutely off the wall here as Yancey. Now granted, he's supposed to be a bigger-than-life Texas lawman, but at the same time, I mean, he yells his lines, he gestures wildly, and he gets some of the absolute ropiest dialogue that nobody could ever sell. You know, stainless woman that I love. All this stuff. It's like, okay, I don't think anyone can make that work, but I don't know. Irene Dunne is better as his wife, who starts off, you know, kind of being in the background, but works her way up to being a congresswoman from Oklahoma. So she has an interesting narrative there, and I don't doubt that Edna Ferber wanted to, you know, make sure she had a strong female lead. And Irene Dunne tries really hard. Again, she's given some pretty crappy stuff to work with too. And then it has a really good supporting cast full of lots of recognizable character actors and actresses, George Stone and Edna Mae Oliver and so on. But much of the criticism of the film today is that a lot of these characters are stereotypes. So Cimarron is criticized very heavily for its racism, which is extremely fair. I would argue it's even toned down from the original book, but you know, the character of Isaiah, the Cravat family's black servant, is just as awful as any early 1930s African-American stereotype you can think of. Saul Levy, played by George Stone, the Jewish character, is actually treated somewhat well. He's invited to join the church and so on, which is specified as being non-denominational. That was a nice touch, but he also plays into a lot of those stereotypes. And interestingly, the film doesn't do much with Native Americans. The book makes it very clear that Yancey and Sabra are standing up for Native Americans' rights. The movie kind of plays around with that a little bit. You know, Yancey says how it was their land first, and there are certain rules that are being established in the town, like paying taxes and things that aren't going to apply to the Native Americans because, you know, their land was taken unjustly. But the movie never really explores that enough, which is a shame, because there are some good ideas there that the film could run with, but it doesn't deliver on it. Has some visual spectacle, and if you like westerns, I think you definitely get into it, but at the end of the day, I have to agree with so many other reviewers and say it's dated. You know, it's a product of its time, it's full of some very questionable scenes, and maybe with a bit of a tighter script and some more inspired direction and some less hammy acting, could really have been a classic. It was remade in 1960 by Anthony Mann. I've actually never seen that version. I need to find that and see, maybe do a comparison on it for some future Oscar season. For 1932, Grand Hotel, also based on a book. So the Grand Hotel in Berlin sees many different people coming in and out, and so this is several of their stories sort of merged together. Greta Garbo, one of her most famous roles, indeed the most remembered part of the film is her famous line, "I want to be alone," is the suicidal ballerina who feels that her life is over. We have John Barrymore as the gentleman thief, acting like an aristocrat but really looking for people to rob. Lionel Barrymore is terminally ill, so he wants to die in this lavish hotel that he could never afford if he wasn't blowing through all his life savings. Wallace Beery is the crooked German businessman who's looking to sneak his way into a big deal. And Joan Crawford is his ambitious secretary. Such a good cast. And each of these stories is interwoven and actually done quite well too, I must say. They don't focus too heavily on any one person. Grand Hotel also has the weird distinction, besides being sort of a vignette film, of being the only Best Picture winner to be nominated for one Oscar, Best Picture, and to win one Oscar, Best Picture. So we don't see too many films that carried that sole nomination, and this is the only one we've ever seen that carried that sole nomination and won it. Garbo's performance is great. I mean, she's good in anything, really. And the Barrymores are quite good. Lionel Barrymore goes off the rails a few times because he's so hammy, but that's Lionel Barrymore for you. And indeed, This movie's proof you could use an old-fashioned telephone as a weapon. This thing is heavy enough it could break someone's skull. So some interesting stuff there. A good early film too for Joan Crawford, well before her Oscar win for Mildred Pierce and things like that. Grand Hotel's kind of forgotten today, but if you want to see a good old-fashioned, soapy 1930s melodrama with these amazing stars, this would certainly be a movie for you, I think. A good starting place if you want to look at 1930s dramas. It even has Lewis Stone in it too, who delivers the second most famous line, "People come and people go, but nothing ever happens." So, fun one there. Certainly much better than Cimarron, but not as good as All Quiet on the Western Front. For 1933, a movie I've talked about before in my New Year's retrospective, we have Cavalcade, also one of the least liked Best Picture winners of all time. Cavalcade, like Cimarron, tries to cram several decades into approximately 2 hours. In this case, 1899 to January 1st, 1933. The problem is that it rushes through certain things a bit too much. But I will say Cavalcade at least has some great montage scenes. The World War I montage is especially good, with these soldiers being worn down more and more, and this beautiful sort of French countryside just being bombed and destroyed as the scene progresses. It also has some good music too. Noel Coward, who wrote the play that this is based on, so the first one that's based on a play as opposed to a book, made sure to incorporate lots of references to what was then fairly contemporary history and lots of popular music as well, to make sure that people could kind of get into that period feel. So I guess the closest thing when you think about Cavalcade would be if we were to make a movie today about history through the early 2000s and 2010s. It's recent enough that it no doubt felt very contemporary as everyone involved had lived through it, but we could also look back and kind of think about how times have changed since then. So the Cavalcade is watchable, as I said before. It has some good moments, but the big letdown, right here on the box actually, the acting. Diana Wynyard, she was Oscar nominated for this, but she is absolutely awful. This is probably her worst performance. She doesn't emote, she doesn't react. This couple is supposed to be living through all these events. They have friends and family members die, sometimes horrible deaths, but you'd never know it because she looks completely disinterested. And Clive Brooke as her husband, Sir Robert, is only slightly better. Again, he looks like everything. Oh, my son just died, whatever. I don't know. It's a shame because I think with a much better kind of leading man and woman that we would have a better film. As it stands, it's kind of fun to look at it through historical glasses. It's got some good editing and whatnot, but for the most part, Cavalcade is pretty much skippable. I don't know. They could have done a lot better. 1933 was such a good year for movies, too. And lastly, we have another one that's held up quite well and is a favorite even today. The winner for 1934, It Happened One Night. So It Happened One Night was directed by Frank Capra. Not the only time we'll be talking about a Capra movie. This will be coming up next week. But although it might not be held in quite the same regard as It's a Wonderful Life or Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, It Happened One Night gave Frank Capra his first Best Director Oscar, helped continue to establish Clark Gable as a leading man, and gave Claudette Colbert one of her best performances, and also showed that a straight comedy, without musical numbers, without a lot of pomp and glamour, could be a Best Picture winner. It wasn't really something, when you look back at all these dramas and epics we've seen, it's kind of nice to have just a straight comedy be the Oscar winner. A lot of films have borrowed from It Happened One Night. A lot of those romantic comedy tropes kind of begin here, it should be noted, and it was also a big influence on Looney Tunes. There's whole articles online about that, which are pretty fun to think about there. But I gotta say, great chemistry between the leads, a lot of fun gags. Spaceballs is actually a remake of it too, I forgot to mention that. There's a really fun little musical number where they sing The Man on the Flying Trapeze on a bus. There's a very funny finale involving the walls of Jericho, something that's still referenced in movies periodically today. And of course the very famous hitchhiking scene where Claudette Colbert uses her leg, proving that it was mightier than Clark Gable's thumb to get a ride. And I really like Alan Hale Sr. as the opera singing driver who picks them up and then later tries to steal their luggage. But Good cast, very propulsive film, a lot of fun. Not Frank Capra's best, not necessarily Gable or Colbert's best, but certainly one that's worth checking out. And if you're looking for a fun comedy, especially after all these heavy dramas, this would be a good place to start. So what are some of your favorites of the early 1930s? Please comment them below, and tune in next week as we cover Mutiny on the Bounty, The Great Ziegfeld, The Life of Emile Zola, You Can't Take It With You, and of course, Gone with the Wind. We'll see you then. Have a good one.